Biden administration expected to announce today that the U.S. will in fact provide Ukraine with cluster munitions. That's according to administration and defense officials as well. These weapons, right, they disperse small bombs over a wide area that risk harming civilian populations. More than 100 countries have signed a UN convention banning the use, by the way, of these types of munitions.
So cluster munitions that we probably didn't know very much about when we woke up today are weapons that can sort of scatter bombs and send out what are called like bomblets and can cause massive damage. Ukraine has asked the United States to send them. They've been asking for them now for months. The United States, it seems, is finally ready to go ahead, Cenk, and do that. And you know, that clip showed us though that they've been used in this conflict already, both by Russia and to a lesser extent Ukraine. But here is in fact why they are so dangerous.
An announcement's expected today, and the US will supply Ukraine with cluster munitions, reportedly thousands of them as part of a new military assistance package worth $800 million. It comes as Ukraine tries to break through Russian lines in its counteroffensive, and these cluster munitions will apparently be very helpful to the Ukrainians in doing that. Now, why is this controversial? Well, cluster bombs break apart midair and scatter smaller munitions over a wide area. Some of them do not explode initially, and they pose a deadly threat to civilians after the fighting, sometimes even years later. Now, the Pentagon claims that the cluster munitions the US is considering sending have a very low dud rate, making that threat much lower.
And a dud rate, to be clear, is when they launch these missiles and these munitions, when they spread all of these bombs in a cluster, some of them don't go off. They're duds, like we just saw earlier this week. Fireworks, July 4th, sometimes it just doesn't go off. Well, when these don't go off, they can cause massive damage, and that damage can last for years and years. These are sort of akin to landmines that could be found later on and cause damage to civilians. So, you know, CNN has reported that they've been talking about this. Ukraine has been asking for these munitions as far back as December. In the first part of the war, Cenk, already, Russia used these cluster munitions already on their own. Since the Russian invasion on February 24th, 2022, preliminary data compiled by the Cluster Munition Monitor indicates that 689 casualties were reported during cluster munition attacks in Ukraine as of July of 2022. These reported casualties included 215 people killed and 474 injured. All of the casualties in Ukraine were civilians, when their status was reported. Ukraine, though, has also, as I mentioned, used these munitions. What is a little different about this, and what Ukraine is saying makes these necessary, is that they want to use them in a defensive manner. They want to be able to hold the line, to wipe out vehicles that are making encroachments into Ukraine, even on the Russian side to a degree, where they're lining up, they're going to small villages and towns. Well, that makes a lot of sense. The damage, though, of course, could get worse if there are that many duds and people, civilians in these towns, come into contact with them. So Ukraine's use of these, again, they've used them already on a smaller scale. Ukrainian cluster munition rockets attacks in the city of Izium in 2022 killed at least 8 civilians, wounded 15 more, according to Human Rights Watch. Today, President Biden spoke on this, and he said that he is reluctant to supply these munitions, but that they will be going ahead with it seems.
It was a very difficult decision on my part. The Ukrainians are running out of ammunition. The ammunition that they call them 155 millimeter weapons. This is a war relating to munitions, and they're running out of that ammunition, and we're low on it. But it was not an easy decision, and we're not signatories to that agreement. But it took me a while to be convinced to do it. But the main thing is they either have the weapons to stop the Russians now keep them from stopping the Ukrainian offensive through these areas, or they don't.
So the president's saying that they're not signatories to this deal. There are 123 countries that are, 12 that have not ratified it, but have said that they want to do it. Russia's not on that list. Ukraine's not on that list. Of course, the United States is not on that list. Many countries are. Most of Western Europe is. But of course, with a number like that, you're going to have small Caribbean nations that are not going to be ever having to worry, we hope, about cluster munitions. The Pentagon spoke out about this. Pentagon Press Secretary Brigadier General Patrick Ryder told reporters Thursday that if a decision is made to send cluster munitions, the military would not give Ukraine cluster munitions with a dud rate, or the percent that failed to explode, creating long-term hazards of more than 2.35%. Biden is barred by Congress from exporting cluster munitions with dud rates over 1%. However, the Washington Post reported that the administration plans to bypass that restriction using the Foreign Assistance Act, which lets the president provide aid regardless of limits if he notifies the Congress that it is in the vital U.S. interest. Cenk?
Okay, so this is, on the weapons is a little bit of a complicated issue, but overall it is not complicated in my opinion. So why do I say it's complicated on the weapons issue? Well, they say this is going to be a very effective weapon against the Russians because the Russians are dug inside Ukrainian territory. When a cluster bomb goes off, it has 88 different explosive devices that create a ripple effect bomb, right? And it digs people out from their trenches, etc. And that's why it's going to be effective. Well, that's true. It's also true that chemical weapons would be very effective. They would totally run out of their trenches because they'd all be dying. Nuclear weapons would be very effective, but they come with a massive downside. But we also then look at these weapons and go, okay, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, out of bounds. Thank God, right? Most of us do. But then we go, okay, but just dropping a bomb on someone, that's okay. So then you say, well, it's war, right? And then some on the right wing will go, well, war is hell. So let's just drop bombs and then see what happens, right? No, so we've got to find a balance. We've got to find where we say, yes, that bomb kills the bejesus out of people, but we're going to use it in this context because we're in the middle of a war and those are combatants and they've invaded this country, right? And we're trying to get back our sovereignty. But here's the weapons we will not use, right? Whether you're Ukraine, US, or the world community, because they're over the line. Now, good news, like we banned chemical weapons, and I think we ended our last chemical weapon today, okay, in America. And so, good, so apparently we can ban weapons, and apparently some weapons are too dangerous to non-combatants and civilians to use, like nukes, chemical, etc. So then the question becomes, are cluster bombs in that group? Well, now we get to the relatively easy part of the conversation, which is, well, Jen Psaki, when she was the White House press secretary, said that when the Russians used cluster bombs, it was a war crime. So when the Russians use it, it's a war crime, but when the Ukrainians use it, it's not a war crime? That doesn't seem right. And 100 different nations have said, do not use these weapons. They're too dangerous to civilians. So now we say, yeah, but we really want to. And when we use it or our allies use it, it's no longer a war crime. And they said, don't worry, the dud rate's gonna be tiny and then we're gonna kill, it'll only go off with 1 to 2.3%. And then Biden says, no, I'm overriding that. So there's no bar on dud rates. So how many civilians are gonna die later? No one knows, hundreds, thousands, we don't know, right? And so when the entire world community is telling you, don't use these things, they're too dangerous for civilians. And you go, yeah, the other guys are awful and monsters for using it, but we're gonna use it too. I think it becomes clear that this is not the right way to go. What do you think, Ray?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more, especially when it comes to the statement from Jen Psaki when she was then the press secretary that it was a war crime if Russia was using it then. I think it's a war crime if Ukraine is using them now. I mean, in any sense of the word, maybe not legally, but at least morally. And also, I think it's a massive setback. Of course, we know that the United States was not a signatory to these treaties, but it massively sets back the progress that's being made to ban the use of these types of weapons within the international community, because the United States might not have fallen to the pressure that was being put on them to sign on. But at this point, they're saying in no uncertain terms that we actually support the use of these kinds of weapons, because Joe Biden can sit there and talk about how difficult it was to come to this decision and how he had to pray on it and use whatever other kind of therapy speak he wants to talk about to sort of elicit some sort of emotional sympathy for how difficult it was for him to decide to do this. But at the same time, he's sending these weapons and he's bypassing the dud limit that is put in place legally and sending them weapons that have a higher dud rate and going past that. So I mean, no matter how he tries to frame it, at the end of the day, they're showing their support for the use of these types of weapons, no matter how much cushy language they put around it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the dud rate thing is the most compelling part of this, right? I mean, that they can control 1% to 2.35%. That to me is the line that we said we would not cross, 2.35%, and now and then or that's the line that these munitions will not surpass. We said 1%. The fact that they're able to fine tune this dud rate, why can't it be zero? I mean, I don't really understand that part of the argument. I also do think, and this is not really counter to what you and Ray are saying, Cenk, I do think that there is a bit of a difference when you are using these as defense against the same type of munition. We have this conversation here in the United States about guns, weaponry. Whenever there is an advanced weapon, it's why the United States and most of the major superpowers are always so reluctant to go to the table on these treaties, is because you're saying to them, all right, you have the gun, we'll take the knife. Again, I think if we can both get down to knives, it's a whole lot better. But in this case, I see why there is that difference and why people are saying that difference matters. Democratic members of Congress, not all of them. Sarah Jacobs, a member from California, saying that she's going to fight this as hard as she can to make sure that this doesn't happen. The president can't really do this. He has to report it to Congress. The tacit approval that Congress gives is going to be an interesting conversation now with Republicans in charge, but with Democrats voicing opposition to the White House.
Okay, I'm going to say last couple things here for me. So number one, the reason they say it's better for defense is because they're saying, look, we're not dropping in Russian territory where it's going to kill Russian civilians later. We're dropping it in Ukrainian territory. So obviously after the war is over, we're going to be very careful because it's our own citizens. So I get the logic of that. But the problem is the Pentagon just put out a statement saying, no, it's okay, the Ukrainians are going to drop these bombs in a, quote, a very careful way. No, there's no dropping bombs in a very careful way. Okay, that's an absurd thing to say. And then they say, oh no, don't worry, we're only going to use it inside Ukraine. But how do we know? So the same thing with the American-made jets that we had a discussion about a month ago that we gave them. They said, no, don't worry, they're not going to use it in Russian territory. Unless they're about to lose and they're really worried and they think a counterstrike at the weapon systems coming down on them from inside Russia should be bombed using American-made jets and cluster bombs. And then what are we going to say? Tut tut? No, they're gone. Once you give them the bombs and the jets, they have them, and they're going to use them in a very careful way if they're winning. But if they're not winning, they're going to be a lot less careful because it's their lives on the line. I get it. I get their perspective, right? But don't be ridiculous with telling me that no, don't worry, they'll only use it in the prescribed ways.
Yeah, and war has an ugly balance sheet too, right? I mean, they look at these things and they say, okay, we're going to lose, if Russia comes in here, we're going to lose X number of people anyway. And if we can push them back or stop them when they cross the line into Ukraine, then we're actually saving lives rather than costing them. Those are the ugly justifications of war. There is some good news today on the munitions and weapons front, which is, and Ray, if you wanted to say something else on this, go ahead, but I was going to spread a cluster of good news, if you will, which is that, we're reminded that in 2017, the United States ceased the procurement of these weapons, of these cluster weapons. And today, as Cenk alluded to earlier, workers at the Bluegrass Army Depot in Kentucky will soon destroy the last of the United States chemical weapons. And the weapons date back to World War I, a 1997 treaty that the United States did sign on to with 193 other countries, which is just about every country you can name. And I would imagine North Korea did not sign on, has until September. It said the United States has until September 1st of this year, doing it about 6 weeks early.
Last thing is, you don't want to encourage escalation. And this tells the Russians, we're escalating, you can escalate. Terrible idea. And why did I change my opinion on the death penalty? Because the Innocence Project proved that 4% of the people we had on death row on a consistent basis were innocent. And I was not okay with executing 4% of the people who didn't do it, right? And here we're saying with the cluster bombs, now we're going over 2.5% of people it's gonna kill that didn't have anything to do with the war. And that's deeply problematic.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.